was young, I had a dream. The dream itself was not an uncommon one among those who shared my age, those on the brink of adulthood. In fact, I would say that it's a very common ambition for anyone with the capability to imagine and wonder. And in a way, I feel it is safe to say that we all aspire to accomplish such a dream in some aspect or another. Some seek it on an intellectual level. Some seek it on an emotional one. And some seek it physically. Adventure, discovery, love, power, truth. All of these words could be used to accurately describe the dream in which I had, in which we all had. Though I doubt that any one word could completely embody the dream itself, for the dream was more than just an aspiration or a wish. It was a destiny, a journey that could only ever be halted by one thing: death. You see, our lives are the dream, and by living, we strive towards it. This destined odyssey that we call life, which originates from that first initial dream, can lead us to many different places. Some of us are led down a trail of tears, one full of agony and suffering. Others are exempt from this and live a life of luxury and convenience. Most of us, however, end up following and living by the center road, a road that will neither be plagued by exuberant and overly frequent misery, nor an utter lack of misfortune. Some find happiness in love, while others only find anger and hate. Some journeys involve the destruction of nations, while others bring about the construction of livelihoods which had before been unknown. Anything is possible. And in knowing this, I would gladly trade my destined discovery for any other fate, whether it be one of utter grief or the opposite. For nothing could be worse than what my scarred soul has stood witness to. The Nevada sun is one of the harshest on the planet. It beats mercilessly down upon all those who expose themselves to it, only allowing breaks from its damning heat during the freezing nights. For those who have not been born and raised in these sweltering conditions, it's easy to understand why they dread the place. Extreme heat is usually only welcome when accompanied by a large body of water, which has always been scarce in the desert wastelands of Nevada. But for someone who has lived there all their life, such as myself, it is home. Not just home, mind you, but a way of life. To my family, those vast mountains of tanned rock and that beating sun are sacred. We were there before the Europeans first discovered America, before the sound of their thunderous muskets and cannons swept across the lands, before the East expanded into the West. But try as hard as we did to hide, the world eventually caught up with us. Along with the settlers came ambition and wonder. As one can imagine, it did not take long for the newcomers to discover the bountiful wealth of gold that lay just inside the mountains of our precious lands. And once the word was out, mining operations became as common in Nevada as scorpions in the sand. Over the years, the mines dried out, as would be expected. But rather than be sealed off, many were simply abandoned, left to be buried by time. Most of these old tunnel networks still exist today and are scattered quite abundantly throughout the otherwise sparse land. It was in these abandoned tunnels that I found joy and wonderment as a child. While others played outside in the blistering sun, I found adventure in the forgotten excavations of those long gone. It was in these places that I felt my dreams of exploration and discovery come to pass. As a young boy, I was limited only to the ones close to home. But as I grew older, began to branch out further and further, till I found myself venturing days at a time in an old pickup to look for traces of these ancient locations. By the time I was in my mid-20s, my fascination with the old mines of Nevada had not diminished. Rather, it had grown. And with it, so had my skills in exploring them. I was 27 when I discovered the ancient mine shaft that would inevitably change my life forever. I had come to hear about it in a nearby town through a man who approached me while I was fueling up at a gas station. He made a comedic remark about the tools in the back of my truck and asked if I was out searching for mines to explore. Politely, I replied with a yes. It was then that he spun me with an extremely interesting tale. He claimed to have discovered the entrance to an old mine a couple of years ago while searching for rare rocks to display in a museum he owned. According to him, it was buried under a considerable amount of brush and foliage in a canyon down the road from the gas station. What really intrigued me, however, was his suggestion that the mine had never been explored or set foot in since the old gold rush days. Naturally, I was hesitant to believe him due to how unlikely it was that such a place would go undiscovered for so long. Every mine I'd ever set foot in had been picked clean by those looking for priceless relics to sell for exuberant amounts of money. This never bothered me. The allure of ancient gold had no effect on me. However, the thought of exploring a mine that had been completely untouched by anyone besides the miners who had made it did seem quite appealing to me. I thanked the man and accepted his offer to reveal the location to me, which he did quite eagerly. In my logical mind, I figured I might as well try to find it, since it was along the route in which I was traveling. It hardly took any time to get there, and although it was difficult and time-consuming, I did eventually find the entrance concealed beneath a considerable amount of brush and foliage, just as the man said it would be. By that time in my life, I could have been considered a professional, judged solely by the equipment I brought along. Within the large backpack I carried, one would find a couple of glow sticks, a flashlight, provisions, water, a knife, and other miscellaneous objects useful for the exploration of such places. Some might say that this was too much, but the old tunnels had a tendency to be dangerous and entirely devoid of light, making it only careful to bring such an array of things. As I stood before the entrance of the mine, which had undoubtedly been full of money-hungry miners and prospectors long ago, I found myself feeling strange about the place. It was a feeling of which I can in no way describe fully. I can only say that it was neither positive nor negative. Rather, it was a kind of anxiety, an understanding that this place would be different somehow. Looking back, I think that deep down, I had known my fate would change that day. And my entire life would become altered by that loathsome expedition into the deep unknown. But rather than take this as a sign to turn away, my excitement twisted it so that I would only expect something marvelous. In my mind, greatness awaited me in that cursed tunnel. And so, I turned on my flashlight and began my journey into the core of terror itself. As I pressed onwards into the mine, I began to become disconcerted by a couple of things. The first of which was how singular the tunnel was. Not once did it split off or turn in any other direction. Rather, it kept going in one continuous path. The second was that there was a distinct lack of relics, which were usually quite common amongst abandoned mines, especially those which had been utterly unexplored. And finally, the entire tunnel was quite steep in its decline. So much so, in fact, that I found it considerably difficult trying to walk back up. It was as if the miners were digging directly towards something deep in the earth, rather than searching for a large gold deposit, as was ordinarily the circumstance. All of these strange details did nothing to pique my curiosity. My mind began to race with ideas as to what awaited me further in the mine. After half an hour or so, I came to a solidly smooth wall. It stood completely vertical before me, without any chips or slants whatsoever, which I found quite unusual. The obstruction was to be the end of my expedition, I thought. After examining it for a few seconds, I noticed a large gap, entirely natural from the look of it, unlike the man-made mine shaft I stood in. It appeared as if the walls had simply pulled apart from each other, leaving a perfectly narrow passage through which one could potentially travel, if he or she chose to do so. Normally, I would have decided that it was far too dangerous to travel through such a claustrophobic crevice, but this was not a normal circumstance. I do not know for certain what compelled me to fit myself into the small opening, though I suspect that the draw of a fated destiny I had felt since entering the mine played a major role. As I traveled through the encroaching rock and stone, I began to become weary that the passage would never come to an end. And if it did, that end would be a solid wall or a sudden and non-traversable narrowing of the tunnel. And on top of that, a strange sensation began to arouse within me. It was entirely different from the feeling I mentioned earlier. Rather, it was an inkling, much more similar to fear. At the time, I figured that it was only natural considering my predicament. I was traveling through an extremely dark and narrow passage that could lead nowhere after all. But looking back, I suspect that the source of my dread was far more sinister in nature. After some time of slowly making my way through the crevice, I finally came to its end. Only it wasn't an end. Rather, it was an opening. What greeted me was not a solid wall or sudden narrowing of the tunnel. Quite the opposite, actually. It was an exit. A way to escape the passage. Upon emerging from the crevice, I found myself in an immense cavern, which impressed upon me a feeling of utter awe. Darkness enwrapped me on all sides, seemingly relentless in its attempt to consume me. As I shone the flashlight up, the sight that greeted my eager eyes was not dissimilar to the night sky. The only difference being the utter lack of stars or any kind of light. The same scene welcomed me on all sides, but two. Downwards, and in front of me. The solid rock on which I stood, and the ancient-looking stone wall to my rear from which I'd come, was all I could definitively feel and see. Everything else was a mystery. Whether it was the horrid darkness or the absolute absence of any kind of noise or smell, I do not know. But something prompted a strong intuition from deep within my consciousness that made me feel as though the cavern was of colossal proportion. Try as hard as I did, my eager flashlight did little to illuminate both the cavern and my knowledge of what exactly surrounded me. I reached down to the floor, picked up a loose pebble, and threw it as far as I could into the looming darkness. The sound received by my ears perplexed me, for it was not the noise of rock meeting rock. Rather, it was the loud echoing thud of rock meeting metal. I snapped a glow stick and placed it at my feet, marking the entrance to the cavern. Then, curiously, I began to move forward with extreme caution, aiming my flashlight directly ahead of me while doing so. It was only after a couple minutes of traveling that the tone of my boots meeting stone beneath my feet changed to a sound more similar to the metal thud I had heard earlier. I aimed my flashlight downward to see a metal, which appeared to be bronze, dug into the solid rock of the earth. My eyes widened as I came to the realization that I was standing on solid bronze. Not bronze ore, not some mutated form of rock. Solid bronze metal. Bronze that had been melted down and shaped this way. I took to a crouching position, gave the metal a soft knock with my knuckle, which emitted a loud echo throughout the cavern. Based on the tone of the knock, I could immediately discern that the bronze was not hollow, that it was indeed a thick layer of melted alloy. Curiosity overwhelmed me. I snapped a glow stick and placed it at my feet, marking the rim of the metal. I began to walk along the threshold in which the bronze and stone collided, but never mixed. As I did so, I did not encounter a single corner, only a monotonous curve which, after a long while, led me back to the glow stick. It was then that I understood the outlining shape of the alloy. It was perfectly circular. Not only that, but in my measuring, I came to have a rough understanding of how truly enormous both the cavern and the plate of metal must be. Anyone who knows anything about nature knows that perfect circles are not overly abundant in our natural world, especially when in the form of a solid bronze-like metal and as deep underground as this. Needless to say, I was breathless. Now that I had traced the shape of the metal, I wanted to explore the center of it. Yet despite my spilling curiosity, I was still cautious, and so my step towards the core was slow and hesitant. As I moved forward, I shone my flashlight all around the surface on which I stood. And as I did so, I began to notice something unusual. There were lumps protruding from the metal, finely chiseled and erected by something other than nature. It was only upon closer inspection that I discovered that they weren't quite lumps. Rather, they were symbols and glyphs, and their positions were not random either. They were arranged like lines of writing, one after the other, in a circular fashion, following the disc-like outline of the metal. They appeared to be hieroglyphs or some form of ancient script. Growing up, the exploration of old mine shafts was not my only interest. I also had an extreme fascination with lost cultures. The Maya, the Inca, even my own Native American ancestral roots. I had studied many of the ancient dialects of lost civilizations from all over the world, but none of them were anything like the archaic chirography that lay around my feet. In fact, the dialects I had studied seemed to be derived from the writing before me, for many of their combined letters and alphabets seemed uncannily similar to the glyphs around me. Lost in wonderment at the marvel on which I stood, I began to understand the impacts of this archaic alloy and what it could have on the world. My mind raced with possibilities as to its origin, yet I could not settle on any conclusion. The only thing I felt certain of in that eerily large cavern was that the circular plate of metal predated any known civilization, or at least any civilizations in North America. Feeling more confident in my safety, I pushed onwards towards the center, more determined than ever to see what awaited me. Eventually, I found myself standing before a circular pedestal made of the same bronze-like metal as the disc-like plate on which I stood. Its height reached up to my abdomen. I was roughly 5'9" at the time, and within the basin-like top of it was a sphere, which appeared to be made of the same alloy as the pedestal. There was more strange writing on the sphere, and even though the hieroglyphs were entirely foreign to me, I was somehow able to read them. Carnate, the tormentor, devourer of worlds, and father of all misery. Upon understanding them, I became disgruntled and unsettled, even more so than I had been previously. There was a certain allure to those words, I felt the desire to grab the object and pull it from its pedestal. But I refused to give in, and quickly turned my attention towards the flat face of the otherwise circular pedestal in an attempt to escape the sphere's power over me. I shone my light upon the surface of the odd column of strange alloy, immediately noticing the odd carvings that had been etched into it as I did so. What was depicted on that abnormal pedestal, I will never forget. Just like the symbols on the sphere, they are etched into my memory. Never before had I seen something so intricate in nature. Despite its beauty, there was a certain terror to it. Many of the figures and shapes were too bizarre for me to understand, but I will do my best to correlate their appearance to you. At the base was a row of consistent zigzags, which I perceived to be some sort of fire, erecting from the flames what appeared to be two rectangular pillars that were covered in the same hieroglyphics as those inscribed onto the floor. There were many other shapes and lines scattered about the mesh of images, none of which I can describe or identify in any way. All save for one, which appeared to be the centerpiece of the network of images. Although I found it quite baffling to stare at, I could vaguely discern what it was, or what it was depicting at least. It was a humanoid shape, topped with an odd head, a head that appeared to be vastly different than that of a human's. Its shape was similar to a dog's skull, yet from both sides of its head protruded goat-like horns that curled continuously. Even if it was merely an image, it still felt as if all the evil in the world had come together and spawned the horrible thing which sat engraved onto that pedestal, and inspired nothing but unmistakable fear within me. Fear so primal and basic that it felt more like a memory than an emotion, as if distress at the sight of this beast had been hardwired into the basic programming of my psyche. And as I continued to stare at it, I couldn't help but think back to the strange phrase which had been written into the sphere of the basin. Carnate, the tormentor, devourer of worlds, and father of all misery. Again and again, those unexplainable words ran through my mind. That strange desire returned to me then, forcing me to turn my gaze upwards towards the sphere and the basin of the pedestal. Out of an unexplainable impulse, I placed my hand over the object and began to softly caress the odd hieroglyphs which covered the strange sphere. It felt warm, like a battery would after being used. That irrepressible urge overwhelmed me at that point. I gripped the sphere in my hand in preparation to remove it. For a fleeting moment, I felt hesitant, but only for a moment. It's interesting to me, such a simple action could be the biggest mistake of my life. I pulled the sphere from the pedestal in one smooth movement, relishing the feel of it in my hand. My joy was only momentary, however, for it was only after a second that a loud and terrifying click echoed from beneath my feet, which was followed by a low tremble. Frightened by the sudden noise and slight shaking of the earth, I began to run towards the crevice through which I had arrived. It was only after stepping off the metal and onto the solid rock that I heard another noise behind me. A noise I cannot identify, as it was no way similar to anything I heard in my life until that moment. The noise piqued my curiosity, so much so, in fact, that I felt compelled to stop and turn around. And as I did so, I was greeted by a radiant light unlike anything other. It was golden in color, yet sinister in nature. As it washed over me in the cavern, I could feel nothing besides fear. And stranger still, it seemed to be originating from the odd hieroglyphs which had been so carefully inscribed upon the bronze-like metal floor. It was then that the metal itself began to mutate into a rust-colored liquid and spread into the surrounding rock, transforming the ancient stone into the same copper-brown tinted metal the liquid once was. I remember feeling my eyes widen in pure wonderment, for I had never seen anything like that before. Deep down, I believe I knew that it was an omen of what was to come. I believe I had some suspicion trying to convince me that such a beautifully odd sight could only herald something so primordial and awful that I would never be able to erase it from memory. Despite this, I continued to stare with awe entirely present in my expression as the metal spread through the rock and stone. And as it did so, I could see the familiar engravings forming within the freshly created alloy, just as they had appeared when I first laid eyes upon them. A loud boom drew my attention from the cavern walls towards the origin of the metal, the space in which the strange alloy had once so quietly resided. Only now, there was no metal, only a perfectly circular hole in the earth, a pit from which only an indescribably putrid smell emitted. My wonderment faded, and fear once again became the most prominent emotion within me. It compelled me to move towards the exit, which had, for a reason still unknown to me, not been covered by the bronze metal. Yet, despite the desire to run away, my feet remained planted, and as immovable as stone. All I could do was stare at that terrible pit, eyes wide and flashlight fixed upon its position, which was just within range. My heart climbed into my throat out of anticipation and anxiety, and for the briefest moment, all was silent as it had been before the noises. Suddenly, a large, red hand with enormous claw-like nails emerged from the pit and slammed into the metallic edge of it. Fascination abandoned me then, and fear took full control. I turned towards the crevice through which I had entered and broke into a sprint. Never before had I ran so desperately or desired to return to the fresh rays of the Nevada sun so badly. My legs carried me swiftly, and it wasn't long until I found myself at the mouth of the narrow passage. Feeling assured of my escape, I turned for what could have only been a few seconds to see what had inflicted so much terror upon me. Concerning what met my eyes in that horrific moment, I will say little. I do not wish to dwell on the memory too long. What greeted me was unfathomably horrific in every aspect imaginable. It seemed to be the upper half of an incredibly massive and red-skinned humanoid looming out of the pit. Its entire body appeared to be coated with some sort of burgundy-tinted slime, which dripped in massive globules from its body. And beneath its skin, I could see writhing shapes and figures. Upon seeing them, I could feel that they were alive within the beast, that they were all gripped by a pain far more severe than anything any man alive or dead has ever experienced. Connected to the torso was that hideous dog-like head which had been engraved upon the pedestal. Only now I could see it clearly and without confusion. Its spiraling horns were tremendous and seemed to seep with nothing but agony. And its eyes were... they were a color I'd never viewed before, and I never wish to view again. By merely looking at them, I could feel pain course through my body. Pain unlike anything I would have been able to imagine before. Its head was, as the pedestal had foretold, incredibly canine in nature. Only there was no fur or hair of any kind. Only blood-colored skin, crawling with tormented shapes, and slime dripping from its impossibly large teeth. That brief eternity of staring at one another ended. However, when the creature opened its large, lipless jaw to let out a roar, so intense in volume that it knocked me and my flashlight backwards into the passage. A loud noise followed the roar. As I perked my head up to peer out of the narrow tunnel, I could see the familiar rust-colored liquid spreading over the mouth of the crevice in which I lied, transforming into that same bronze-like alloy covered in strange hieroglyphics, and create a barrier between me and the thing from the pit. Then I ran. Concerning my escape through that ancient tunnel, I don't remember very much. I was in a panic, my vision hazy. I was discovered sprawled out on a road near the mine by a nighttime driver. I was promptly taken to a hospital. I was treated for a couple of broken bones and minor cuts. I was questioned as to how I obtained such injuries. I could provide no answers, only a blank stare. When I was finally released from the hospital, I was given all of my belongings back. Among them was the horrid sphere, which I had recovered from that wretched abyss. And that's it. That's my story, my encounter. That's my recounting of the day I came face to face with genuine evil. An evil so true in its form that no man could fully understand it. I don't know what it was nor where it came from, and I don't want to. I do feel certain that both the metal and the giant were not of this world. The earth would never be able to conjure such things naturally. For the past 6 years, I've lived in misery because of what I experienced in that cave. Whenever I close my eyes, I see that face, those eyes, those awful horns. Every time I do, the fear I felt in that moment fills me once again. I rarely sleep anymore. I just lay there with my eyes open, too afraid to close them. I can still hear that roar, every second of every day, reverberating through my memory, as if I was still in there, in that cave, at this very moment. And that's not the worst part. The worst part is that I know I'm not insane. I know that what I saw was real. I know it's still out there, pounding away in its metal prison. And I know that a day will come when it's freed once again. And that day will be our last. That day will be the one which we join the writhing shapes beneath its skin. When our blood becomes the slime that drips from its unnatural body. And although that day can be eternally delayed, it can never be prevented. Whether you perceive me as a raving madman or as a prophet preaching our doom, I don't care. These words are my final. These thoughts are my last. Every man has a breaking point, and I have reached mine. There is a gun in my hand, and I intend to use it. Not on anyone else, mind you. They have hope and reason to live in their hearts. They have not seen what lurks beneath. This weapon, so commonly associated with sadness and war, is to be my salvation. I find it oddly heavy. Don't try to find the sphere either. I stowed it away in a place where it will never be found. Consider this last request to be my will in its entirety. Don't try to find the mine or its inhabitants. You'll only find a nightmare more horrific than anything you have dared to imagine. And then the beast, carnate, will be free.